For this particular class, we're looking at the global information systems and market research in an international market research environment. We're going to focus primarily on the market research aspect. The global information systems tends to mimic information systems that we would find in any company, so therefore I don't find that as interesting to look at. So we're going to focus on the idea of market research. So laid out here on the left-hand side of the chart, we find the research process laid out. The first area that we want to be concerned with is, what is the firm objective? And this seems very obvious, but it's funny how many times people do not clearly identify from the outset what it is they're trying to accomplish. So what and why are we conducting this research for in order to accomplish? So we want to make sure we have the firm objective clearly established in everyone's mind before we even begin to look at this process. Then we want to look at the information requirement. What is it that we are going to try to do, and why are we doing it? And again, that dovetails very nicely with the firm objective, because this is going to tell us what type of research information we need, and can also give us a chance to pause and decide whether or not we can actually find that information in the cultural situation we're going to find ourselves doing the research. The third block is the idea of problem definition. And when we think about problem definition, we want to go back to that idea of having a cultural research bias, or a research bias in general. So when we look at this, we want to make sure that we are not defining the problem in a cultural context that does not fit the situation that we're looking at. So it's very important when we think about the self-reference criterion that we talked about previously in the class, that we're not using that to define the problem, that in fact we are defining the problem in the context of the society where we're going to actually conduct the research. The fourth unit, or part of the research analysis that we want to look at, is what's going to be our unit of analysis. It's very important to understand whether we're going to do this on a country or regional or global basis. So are we going to be looking just at one population, or are we going to be looking at multiple populations which may have different cultural contexts? And then within those different settings, what groups are we looking at? So what is the segments that we want to examine? So choosing the unit of analysis becomes very important at this stage to be able to identify how much data we're going to have to collect. The next step that we want to look at is the idea of examining data availability. We are pretty spoiled in the United States, quite frankly. We have a lot of secondary data that's readily available, typically at a low cost. So if you think about something like the US Census, it provides a great deal of demographic information that almost anyone can access. So it's easy to find good secondary data in the United States and in most developed countries. Once you go outside of those parameters, however, the secondary data may not exist, or if it does exist, it may not be reliable. And therein lies a major problem for us, because if the secondary data exists and we take it at face value and it's wrong, of course our research is probably going to be skewed in the wrong direction. So we want to think about, is the data going to have reliability to it? And if it doesn't, then we're going to have to conduct primary research. And if we're going to conduct primary research, that always entails a much more costly research project. When we start thinking about doing that and conducting it with the process of back translations, etc., the cost rapidly mounts. So we want to look at what data might be available to start that we can get underway without investing significant amounts of money. And if it's not available, then we're going to have to figure out, do we have the budget for this? And that actually gets into the next point, which is to assess the value of the research. You can use a concept called the value of perfect information. And if you imagine a range, so to speak, that on the bottom you have no information and on the top you have perfect information, you're somewhere on that spectrum, and you're trying to decide, okay, what happens if I have better information? So although we don't believe we'll ever get perfect information for making a decision or doing research, the idea is if we spend money for research, we should improve the amount of information we have, and as a result we should come closer to perfect information, which in theory means we'll make better decisions. But you can actually do a cost analysis using this concept and figure out if the value of the information that you gain is actually worth it or not, based on what you think the financial outcomes are going to be. So that's one idea to think about when you're looking at this, because the value of the research is such that if it's going to be prohibitively expensive, you may stop at this point and say it's not worth pursuing this research because it's just going to be too expensive. We're going to do a different approach, and yes, it's not perhaps as scientific, but it certainly doesn't cost as much, and we think we can probably find as much information as we could by actually conducting a formal research study. When we look at the area of research design, what we want to be aware of is that we're going to face certain issues in data collection. And in this area of data collection, one of the first things we'll run into are cultural attitudes. So for example, in the United States, people are generally pretty willing to share their opinions and participate in research. But you may find in foreign cultures that that's not true. There may be different attitudes towards how someone views you asking them questions. It may be that you can't conduct a focus group with mixed sex participation. For example, the males and females may have to be segregated. And so cultural attitudes are going to play a huge role in terms of how you're going to be able to collect data. There's also going to be the issue of data reliability. So will the people give you answers from a socially desirable context that they think that's what you want to hear, and therefore it's not really going to be of much use to you because they're just giving you the answers that they think you want to hear, not which they really believe. There also may be legal considerations as far as what kind of research is allowed to be conducted, or if you have to have approvals in order to do that type of thing. So you're always going to have to check the local legal environment to find out what's permissible. There's also the area of technological distribution. So if we want to do a web-based survey or some sort of telephone interview, does that technology exist, and is it widespread enough that you're going to get a representative sample among that segment that you're focusing upon? Also, with the comprehension of methodology, particularly if you're using local partners to help conduct this research, do they understand the methodology that you've designed? Because if they don't, they may not collect the data in the manner in which you want it to be collected. So you have to be able to explain very specifically what it is the methodology that we're going to use. Translation issues are always a big thing if we're going to conduct the research in the host country language. There's many layers of meaning that may not necessarily come across in a basic translation. So you have to think about that in terms of cultural sensitivity, what types of questions you can ask, as well as what the actual language is saying. And then there's the issue of perception equivalency. So for example, when we use a Likert scale in the United States, and we use, for example, a 1 to 7 scale, we typically are very comfortable using endpoints of 1 and 7. But in some cultures, they may not want to be that negative or that positive, and so they typically may shy away from using those endpoints. And in fact, then a 2 and a 6 become the same thing as a 1 and a 7, but we wouldn't know that necessarily. And so we need to do some testing to identify if the audience participating in the research perceives our measurement the same as we do, as we've been trained or are accustomed to using in our home country. So perception equivalency becomes a major issue when we're trying to do this. Now, how do we combat these issues? Well, we can use multiple indicators. In doing that, we can come at the question from several different ways and then have comparative answers to see if we're actually measuring the information the way we were hoping to. You can also rely on the local population and researchers to develop some customized indicators that might do a better job of capturing the information we're looking for. You can also conduct comparative assessments, so you can use existing research to get some sort of idea of how the data was collected and what did it measure. So there's other ways that you can do that. You can also go out and do some observational research. So for example, if you can have some secondary data or opinions that you've collected, you can simply go and watch how people are using products or what they're consuming, how they dress, etc., and see does in fact the observations that you're making measure up to what the secondary data and opinions are telling you. Also, in the area of research design, we have to think about the types of markets that we may be dealing with. So, for example, one type of market would be the existing market. So the customer needs are already being served by at least one company. In this case, we know that the market exists, and it's not that we're trying to evaluate something that we think is going to happen. We can observe what's going on. So the research design can actually build off the experience that people already have with the product and be able to examine what kind of sales are being conducted, etc., and how the product's being used. A latent market is one that's a potential market in which demand would materialize immediately if an appropriate product were made available. So it's not that the people are afraid of the product, unfamiliar with it, etc. It's simply that it hasn't been introduced yet into that society. And so if it were to be introduced, this potential market would immediately materialize and it would be turned into an existing market. And of course, this is going to be the type of situation when we're taking a product that we've already developed in our domestic market and we're going to take it overseas to where it hasn't been introduced yet, but we're reasonably certain that the needs and benefits that the product supplies are going to be readily adopted by the destination country. The third one is one a bit more of a reach here that when we're trying to research it, we're trying to define an incipient market, which is a potential market will emerge if certain trends, and these can be economic, so how much money are people making, demographics, so is there a teen culture that's going to appear in a matter of years, are there political changes, or are there sociocultural trends? And if these factors come together, we believe that there's going to be a particular market that will emerge. Research designed to capture how much people are willing to work with this type of market or will participate in is of course much more difficult because it doesn't actually exist, and it's making a lot of assumptions about what's going to take place in order for that to come about. And of course these trends have to continue, but if they do, it's very likely that this market is going to develop. Continuing with the area of research design, now we're at the point where we have to determine an appropriate research methodology. Could be a survey research we're going to do, could be experimentation, consumer panels, focus groups, observation, and all of these things of course have to be conducted within the parameters of what the host country is willing to accept and is considered a norm as far as the type of research that's allowed or practiced in that particular country. Then we have to determine the sampling technique, and this is just the same as we would do in a domestic environment. Are we going to use a probability sample, or are we going to use a non-probability sample? Arguments can be made for both types of samples. It's not that one's particularly better than the other. It depends on what it is we're trying to actually accomplish with the research. So this goes back up to our information requirement and what is it we're trying to do. It also ties back into the firm objective of what is it we're trying to capture. When we come to the next step, which is data analysis, it's really no different than what we would do in our home environment. We're going to make sure we clean up the data and it's coded correctly for the information that we're going to be running in whatever program we're going to use to analyze it. And then we have to select the appropriate analytical technique. And hopefully, if we've set up the research correctly, selecting the appropriate analytical technique shouldn't be really too difficult because we've already projected what it is we're trying to find in terms of information requirement, what our objective is. So we should already know what analytical technique we're going to use to take a look at what the data is going to try to tell us. And finally, as in any kind of research communication we're going to try to do, we're going to interpret and present the results. So we're going to try to communicate these results in an understandable format to our various audiences, whomever they might be. So if we take a look at this slide, countries with the highest per capita GDP in 2015, this is some representative secondary data that we could use in an international environment. And if you note up in the upper right hand corner, it says the source is the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, certainly a reputable organization. So we would be fairly confident that this information is good. And this type of basic secondary research in an international marketing situation allows us to take a look and say, okay, well, if we have a product that requires that people be able to afford it, we can scan down this list and see what the various GDPs are in these various countries and determine whether or not those make good target markets for us. Now we want to look at some emerging trends in market research. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all being used internationally, but if you look at some of this research that has come out very recently, it gives you some idea of what types of market research methods are being used. And what's interesting about it is they're all heavily technology based, such as things as predictive analytics, facial analysis, eye tracking, social media analytics. So when we look at these types of things, we can expect to see these, of course, in the most well-developed countries, but these are different types of research techniques from what we are traditionally used to using. So it's very interesting to take a look and see how their use is growing over periods of time, and that if you want to try to take this kind of research, now if you think about it in a global context, it's going to probably be very challenging to go into some environments and use this. And yet at the same time, these are some of the research methodologies that are emerging in market research, and we should be aware of those. Finally, to wrap up this segment, in class we did an exercise looking at this scenario about a solar grill that had been developed, and we were interested in taking it possibly to Uganda as a country that might be able to make use of this. And if you read through the scenario, you should think about a little bit about what kind of challenges is the company likely to face if they want to do market research about whether this solar grill would be successful in the Ugandan market versus where it's been developed and sold presently, which is to say in Europe. So give this some thought and think about the ideas that you might run into or problems that you might run into in conducting market research in this type of environment.